Hey everybody, what is up? Welcome back to Final Trade, special jackhammering noises in the background edition. So last week I brought you a video talking about pre-modern Magic, the constructed format I like best, and I briefly mentioned a deck that I called Turbo Stompy. And this video is going to be more in-depth on that deck. So Turbo Stompy comes out of a deck type called Senior Stompy, which is it's several types of decks kind of closely related that date back to the 1990s. And originally, you kind of had a choice with the way you would build that deck, where you would either use a bunch of green creatures that accelerated your mana in order to get out medium-sized creatures, or maybe you'd use them to play longer for huge creatures. You may not use much mana acceleration at all and just go for medium and large green creatures. Remember, the game was a lot more simple back in the mid 1990s, and your options of what to do were necessarily a bit more limited. And I've always been a fan of Senior Stompy. I actually played it in high school in the 1990s. And more recently, as I've come back into Magic in the last several years, I built a Senior Stompy deck that was pre-modern legal. And I've kind of modified it more and more over time to be, well, basically to try to be a lot faster, to give up ultimate power in order for more speed. And so this is where it kind of is now, and I've taken to calling this Turbo Stompy as a kind of funny play on Turbo Stasis. But essentially what you have is a lot of your staple green creatures that accelerate your mana. And, of course, the Priest and Seeker of Skybreak. So every creature in this deck right now is an elf, and so it will power up Priest of Titania. And the really nice thing about Seeker of Skybreak is you can imagine in a deck where most of your mana is coming from tapping creatures, this is essentially a clone of any creature you need. So if you need more Priest of Titania mana from all the elves, this is a clone of Priest of Titania. If you need your Argothian Elder to untap some extra lands, this is like a clone of Argothian Elder. So, of course, this is the Argothian Elder, untap 2 target lands. Now, I'm somewhat dissatisfied with this card. Sadly, in the Great Creature Type update of 2007, when they went back and errata'd several hundred old creatures and got rid of different creature types and changed a bunch of creature types, the Ley Druid from early Magic, he was the 3 mana 1/1 green creature who tapped to untap a land. Sadly, he was reclassified as a human and not an elf, and so he doesn't quite fit here. And again, I'm trying to keep as many elves in this deck as possible because now, ultimately, you use this as your attacking creature to win with. You no longer need things like crawl giants and giant worms and all of these other things, killer bees and krakens and various other creatures that in pre-modern versions of Senior Stompy were the way of actually killing your opponent. When you play this as a tribal elf deck, you just stick with this. And the really nice thing is it has trample. And so your opponent can't just delay by throwing tokens in front of it or throwing other garbage creatures in front. So it means that essentially in a 60-card deck, you have 24 elves. And your creature that actually does the killing for you has power and toughness equal to the number of elves that you have. So the next two, Concordant Crossroads, of course, this is just an unbelievable card. And it gets kind of included into pre-modern legality by virtue that it was reprinted in Chronicles. So yes, it's a Legends card originally, but if it was reprinted in Chronicles, it's pre-modern legal. And this card is just unbelievable. If you have it in your opening hand and you can play it early, you can have points where you have 6 or 8 or 10 mana on the third turn and 40 or 50 mana on the fourth turn. Ambush Commander, I'm pretty unsatisfied with this card. And, when I first saw it, I thought, oh, all your forests become elves. Well, that'll just increase the power of your Priest of Titania and your Heedless ones. And the problem is you typically don't get many forests out. This deck only plays 11 forests in the current form that I have it in here. And they come out slowly. I mean, if there's only 11 in the deck, you may not draw that many. You can only play 1 per turn anyway. And so this just, it doesn't add a lot. I would almost rather have a second Concordant Crossroads just to increase the chance of drawing it early in the game, and I'm really considering doing that. Instill Energy, of course, this is a great card because if you play a Priest of Titania on the second turn, depending on what else you've drawn, sometimes you can go ahead and hit it with Instill Energy, make typically 2 mana, and then untap it and make 2 more. And there are ways that you can just end up playing 4, 5, sometimes 6 cards by the end of your second turn between this and the Priest and one of these elves, and maybe if you get a Gaia's Cradle in your opening hand. So the ability of this deck to ramp up its mana very early is huge. The other nice thing about this is later on you're going to see Winter Orb. So if you have Winter Orb logging down lands, you can use this during your opponent's turn to untap something like your Argothian Elder. And so you can have extra rounds of untapping your own lands. And of course, Vitalize to instantly untap all your creatures for 1 mana. And so the mana output of this deck, because it's dependent on the number of elves you have, and you have so many elves, and you have things like Instill Energy and Vitalize, the mana potential is basically quadratic to the number of elves you have. And so then when you can play something like this, you just double that amount of mana again. Right now, I've got 2 Desert Twisters in here. Of course, destroy any permanent. It's just very versatile, and who cares if it costs 6 mana? Again, this deck just is preposterous with the amount of mana it pulls. Of course, you could add something different like Naturalize, which is just a green-colored version of Disenchant. You have Thermokarst and other things that specifically destroy land. There's a lot of choices, but this one just has versatility. If your opponent is playing something like an Ensnaring Bridge or a Crawl Space or something like that really locks you down, well, you can just get rid of it. Whatever it is, you can get rid of it with this. So I like the versatility, and you can't always just try to sprint for the finish as fast as possible. You do have to respond to your opponent. Now, of course, a tribal elf deck with Coat of Arms, not strictly necessary. I mean, the Heedless ones get big enough on their own, but this kind of gives you another option to win. If you get to turn, say, 4 or so, and you haven't quite ramped up your mana and your card drawing combo to the point that you're drawing out your entire deck, this can give you a win otherwise, because if you have 5 or 6 elves already, it's enough with this. And of course, one of the powerhouse cards of this deck, Slate of Ancestry. Discard your hand and draw a card for every creature you control, which typically will be 4, 10, 15 creatures. So you will pretty quickly get to the point where you might accidentally draw the rest of your library out. And this is where the real power of the deck comes from. You hit this point where between Instill Energy and Vitalize, your Priests, your Seekers of Skybreak, and everyone else, you have just unbelievable amounts of mana, maybe 40, 60, 80 mana available to you. And then you go and you draw, say, 8 more cards. And, well, hopefully one of them's another Slate of Ancestry, and it's a whole nother handful of elves, and maybe another Vitalize or something else good. And then you play all those, you play the additional copy of Slate of Ancestry you just drew, and you do Slate of Ancestry again. And that's what typically turns 4 or 5 are going to look like with this deck. Sometimes you can get there on turn 3, not consistently, but sometimes you can. And so ultimately that's what you're doing with this deck, is that you're drawing 8, 10, 12, 14 cards 2 or 3 times on a turn. And of course, eventually you ought to get a Concordant Crossroads, you'll have a couple Heedless ones, you'll have tons of elves, and then you can just win the game on that turn. You're not waiting for the next turn to be able to attack with the creatures you just put out. And all the better if you pull the Coat of Arms, because then all of these elves that you just cast can go ahead and attack and kill your opponent. Now, Winter Orb, this is great. You're not relying on land for all of your mana. Your opponent probably is, and so you can help shut down their ability to generate mana and do what they want to do with Winter Orb. And 4 poorly proxied copies of Gaia's Cradle, because no, I'm not going to spend $1,000 building a deck. But it speaks for itself. It's one of the most powerful lands ever created, and it's pre-modern legal, unlike the poor unfortunate Tolarian Academy. And like I said, 11 forests. So, there's a lot of other cards that you could put in here and that I'm considering. One thing I'm dissatisfied with in this deck is the Argothian Elder. Like I said, it's unfortunate that the Ley Druid got eroded into a human and not an elf, but costing 4 mana is not good, and all he does is untap lands. Well, I'd rather untap creatures. I'd rather do something else that maybe accelerates a little harder, because all he can really do is untap Gaia's Cradles. That's really the useful thing he could do. So I've thought about other things, like there's the legendary elf Raphelos. I might put a copy of him in here. He's 2 green mana, and he taps to give you one green mana for every forest you control. And so it would be another kind of low mana producing elf that would have a little more capability later in the game. He might produce up to 3 or 4 mana when you tap him later on in the game, but he would give you an additional cheap elf that you could get out early. If you're thinking about other things to do with this deck, there is a Taunting Elf. He's a 0/1 for 1 green mana who comes with Lure on him. Of course, that's useful if you're just going to try to win by bum rushing with all these elves. There's Nature's Chosen. That's an enchantment from Alliances that's actually nearly a copy of Instill Energy. It's the same cost, and it has the same effect, except it doesn't have haste. And it has an additional effect to be able to untap artifacts if the creature it enchants is white, which doesn't apply to this deck. But it would give you the ability to basically have 4 more Instill Energies in the deck. Of course, there's Birds of Paradise, which would help supplement these 2 guys and more consistently give you a creature to pop out on turn 1. The only downside is they are not elves. There's Elvish Guidance. It's a land enchant that basically turns every land into kind of a Gaia's Cradle. It's that the enchanted land will produce 1 more green mana for every elf in play. Of course, Ley Druid I already mentioned. There's an Elder Druid from Ice Age. Of course, he in the creature update of 2007, he got turned into a elf and not a human, even though he was a cleric druid. I think he's an elf cleric druid now. I guess he multi-classes. So he costs 4 mana, and for 4 mana you can tap him to untap an artifact, which of course you could use to untap this again if you needed to. But if you really feel like you need the opportunity to untap this, maybe Voltaic Key is the way to go. Of course, it's only 1 mana to cast and 1 mana to activate, but it's not an elf. So, you kind of try to balance all those things together. There's also Well-Wisher. It's kind of weak. It's a 2 mana elf that taps to give you 1 life for every elf in play. I always wanted life gaining to kind of work in Magic, but it just was never powerful enough. I often wonder if you could kind of homebrew and triple the amount of life gain that every effect in the game produces, and just kind of put a factor on it like that and see how high would you have to ramp up life gain to actually make it a viable strategy in Magic. But it's a cool card. It goes in with the theme of the deck, but I just don't think it's powerful enough. Now, there's some other stuff you could think of, like Recycle. That's the enchantment that enforces a hand size of 2 on you. You skip your draw phase, but every time you play a card, you draw a card. Well, when you have tons of mana and tons of cheap creatures, you can play a lot of cards in a turn, and being able to draw one every time you play one would be pretty powerful. That's something I'd like to experiment with. It may ultimately be that Recycle is just much better than Slate of Ancestry. I don't know. I haven't tested that yet. There's also Well of Knowledge, which is the artifact you can activate during your draw phase. You can pay 2 mana to draw an additional card. But again, only during your draw phase. And maybe that's the right way to go, because you get a lot more flexibility. You only have to draw at 1 time, and then it's available. But I don't know, it's not as mana efficient as Slate of Ancestry, and I don't know. It may not be the right way to improve this deck. Another problem that I have playing this deck is it always feels like you have so much mana and you may not have what you need to use it. And so you sit there and you're kind of wishing you had something like Killer Bees or Hurricane or Stream of Life or some kind of effect that could just absorb this 40, 60, 80, 200 mana you're sitting with, the potential to create, and you have nothing to sync it to because maybe you've only drawn one slate of Ancestry and you've already used it this turn. And so you just have to end your turn with 100 mana available to you and nothing to do with it. But, Hurricane is only good if you are ahead. I guess you can force a draw with it by killing your opponent and yourself. And then, again, Stream of Life. Sometimes it's good enough not to lose. You can't win with it, but you may be able to keep from losing. So those are my thoughts on some cards you could potentially add to this. And, something I think about a lot when I'm playing this, especially with the Instill Energies and the Vitalizes, I start to think of, what if I could build a blue-green elf stasis deck? And it sounds like a stupid idea, but you could have Birds of Paradise, you could have Quirion Elves, which are the elves that when they come into play, you name a color and you tap them to make a mana of that color. There's Urborg Elf that taps for a green, a blue, or a black, I think. And, there's several different elves that can produce blue mana to pay the upkeep on stasis. And if you had Instill Energy and you had Nature's Chosen, which was that Alliance's copy of Instill Energy, then you could just keep those elves untapped all the time and keep producing mana to pay the upkeep on stasis and lock the board down. It's an interesting idea. Maybe I'll start pinning down a deck list for it and see if there's any potential there for just kind of a fun casual deck. But I love stasis decks to start with, so maybe I'm just being delusional and hoping that it could work as an elf stasis tribal deck. So let me know what you think, guys. Have you ever played Senior Stompy? Do you love it? What flavor of it did you play? Because when I was a kid in high school, I played the big creature version, and then in the last year, I've played more of this heavy mana ramp and more and more and more mana ramp, and just focusing on speed as time goes on. So I think that's where the real power of this deck is. Let me know what you think, guys. Otherwise, like, comment, share, and subscribe. Join me on Final Trade. Thanks a lot.